Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Mr. Mazzoro. Today we're going to talk about pollination and fertilization. We're going to talk about what the differences between those two things are and really suss out what pollination is and the different types of pollination versus what the results of fertilization are and what you can tell about a plant by that. We're going to start with what is pollination and what are the different types of pollination. And then we're going to talk about specific adaptations that plants have that assure that they'll be cross-pollinated and not self-pollinated and why that's important. And then we're going to talk about specifically what the difference between pollination and fertilization is. And finally, looking at a seed, what can you tell about a plant by looking at the seed? After you get fertilization and a plant develops a seed, what you can learn about a plant by looking at that seed. So, what's pollination? Very, very simply, it's the transfer of pollen from stigma to carpel. If you think about pollination as a part of sex, which really is what it is, it's sex, transfer of pollen, sperm, from stigma to carpel, male to female. Pollination is sex. But remember, it's not sex that results in a baby. That would be fertilization. You can have sex without resulting in a baby. So, pollination would be the sex, fertilization would be the baby. There are two types of sex, two types of pollination. Cross-pollination, where animals transfer pollen from one organism to a completely different organism. And self-pollination. This is asexual reproduction. This is where animals transfer pollen between the same flower or different flowers that are on the same plant. Because you only have one organism here, that would be asexual, not sexual, like cross-pollination. Nature prefers to cross-pollinate. The reason is because self-pollination leads to inbreeding and decreased genetic diversity. And remember, nature, or specifically plants, got really, really good at sex because they wanted to have lots of genetic diversity, to have lots of variants to survive a lot of different scenarios. So there's certain evolutionary traits that plants evolved that allow them to ensure self-pollination. The first, some flowers are male and others are female. Some plants are male and others are female. If you have a male plant, a plant that produces incomplete flowers with just carpels on them, none of those flowers can fertilize themselves. That pollen has to be transferred to a female plant or a plant that produces flowers with only stigmas. That ensures that any fertilization takes place would be cross-pollination, or any pollination that takes place would be cross-pollination, not self-pollination. Squash flowers are an example of this. There are some pumpkins, squash flowers that are male, or plants that are male. They produce incomplete flowers with only stamens, and other pumpkins that only produce pumpkin plants that only produce flowers that are female. So coincidentally, actually, all pumpkins come from the female part. That makes sense because the seeds used to be the egg inside the female's ovary. The ovary actually is the pumpkin, the fruit. Some flowers have different parts that mature at different times, and it's kind of hard to see in this particular example, but this is a wild geranium, and the carpels don't open at the same time as the stamens. And as a result, these pollen, the sperm from the stamens, can't ever be transferred to the carpel. The stamens only have active sperm when this carpel is closed. So by maturing its stamens and carpels, its male and female parts at different times, it ensures that that sperm has to be carried to a different plant. It can't ever be pollinating the same plant, self-pollination. Last, some plants just can't be self-pollinated. Opium poppies are a good example of that. They literally have genes inside of them that disallow the reception of their own sperm. They know the difference between sperm from them and sperm from other types of poppies, and as a result, you have to transfer sperm from one poppy to an egg of a different poppy plant. Poppy plants can't be fertilized with their own sperm. It's genetically impossible. It's like fertilizing it would be like fertilizing a flower with dog sperm. You wouldn't get a dog flower hybrid. The genes don't align. The sperm isn't receptive. They're not receptive to that sperm. Humans don't like cross-pollination. They prefer self-pollination. They prefer self-pollination because they like to preserve traits, and self-pollination, asexual reproduction, preserves these traits. This is sort of an extreme example, actually, of self-pollination. These are Chinese apple farmers, and some provinces of China used pesticides so heavily for so long that they actually killed all of the bees in their province. And as a result, the only way that their apple trees were going to get pollinated is if they did the pollinating. So you can see these all throughout the pollination, these Chinese apple farmers, in the early morning, climbing trees and with a paintbrush going out on the limbs and pollinating all those plants. A lot of people use this scenario as an example of kind of like the damage we do to the environment. And true, it is a pretty shocking example, seeing like a human bee going around and pollinating every single plant with a paintbrush. The problem is actually that if you do a little bit more reading on this particular province, that once all these trees were being self-pollinated, they actually yielded much more fruit than when they were pollinated by bees. And that's because humans, if you're going to climb up there in the early morning with a paintbrush, you're going to make sure that you get every single flower on that branch. You're not going to miss any. Whereas a bee just kind of only flies at certain times, not when it's raining, not at night. And bees fly around randomly, not making every flower. So kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other as to whether this is a great example of evolutionary environmental disaster or not. But it's certainly an example of humans self-pollinating, transferring pollen from flowers of one plant to the flowers of another plant to ensure that every apple on this tree is exactly the same. Fertilization is making a baby. After the pollen grain gets transferred, 2 sperm cells leave that pollen grain. One forms a tube, the other swims down that tube and fertilizes the egg, making a seed. That's the process of fertilization. 2 sperms per pollen grain, one makes a tube, the other swims down the tube, fertilizes an egg, the egg becomes a seed. Once that seed develops, it has a food supply, and those food supplies become the first leaves of the plant, what are known as the cotyledons. These original leaves, the first leaves to emerge from a seed, are not photosynthetic. Instead, the secondary leaves, or the true leaves, the secondary leaves to emerge from them, are photosynthetic. Some plants have 2 seed leaves, dicots, inside their seeds. Other plants have only 1. And this is the difference, one difference between seeds. Monocots have only 1 cotyledon, dicots have 2. As a result, monocots have 1 leaf emerge from their seed originally. Dicots have 2 leaves emerge from their seed originally. Neither one of those first leaves that emerge from the seed are photosynthetic. The first leaves, or the second set of leaves to emerge from the plant, those are the first photosynthetic ones. Aside from looking at a seed and determining if it breaks into 2, dicot, or if it stays in 1, monocot, you can also determine stuff about the specifics about the plant by the size of the seed. There are small seeds and large seeds, and small seeds belong to plants that need to spread their seeds over wide areas or need to produce more seeds in one growing season. Maybe they live in deserts and they need lots and lots and lots of seeds because most of them are going to die. Anytime you see a small seed, you know that it's a plant that needs to either spread its seed over a wide area, maybe it lives in a field, or it needs to produce a lot of seeds in one growing season. The smallest seed of any flowering plant is actually vanilla beans. The little black specks that you see in vanilla ice cream, those are actually the seeds of vanilla beans. This is a mustard seed. Again, a plant that needs to spread its seeds over a wide distance. Why are other seeds very, very large? Well, large seeds contain more food. So usually plants that produce large seeds live in dry environments or densely vegetated areas like forests or jungles. They need their seeds to last a long time because there's a big chance that the proper growing conditions aren't going to come about for a while. They need to wait for a tree to fall, or they need to wait for a wet spring or something like that. So the seeds need to hibernate for a long period of time. Small seeds spread farther. you need lots of them. Larger seeds, you need less of them, but those seeds need more food to survive for longer periods of time. So that's it. Pollination, the spread of pollen. Fertilization, sperm entering egg, making a baby. The different types of pollination are self-pollination and cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is taking pollen from one organism and transferring it to flowers of a completely different plant. Self-pollination is within the same flower or within flowers of the same that are on the same plant. Cross-pollination is sexual. Self-pollination is asexual. So plants prefer cross-pollination, sexual reproduction. And in order to ensure that, some plants develop incomplete male and female flowers. Some plants mature their female parts of their flowers at different times than their male parts. And some plants' sperm is actually incompatible with their own egg. That makes sure that every fertilization event that happens from sperm from another plant. The difference between pollination and fertilization is the difference between sex and making a baby. Pollination is sex, just transfer of sperm. You can have sex without making a baby, which would be fertilization. You can pollinate something without it necessarily being fertilized. You can pollinate a plant without it actually bearing fruit, fertilization. And fertilization, when it does happen, generates, in the cairns of a flowering plant, or gymnosperm, a seed. And by looking at that seed, you can look at its size and figure out that large seeds probably need more food to survive harsher conditions. Small seeds belong to plants that need to spread their seeds over long distances, like those that belong in a field. You can also look at the seed itself. If it breaks into two, it has two cotyledons, it's a dicot. If it doesn't break into two, it's a monocot. So that's it. That's plant reproduction and generation of a seed. In the next lesson, what I'm going to talk to you about is fruits. Now that we have a seed, how are we going to get that seed as far away from the parent plant as possible? Because if that seed lands too close to the parent plant, that baby seed is going to germinate and start competing with the parent plant for nutrients and sunlight and water. And the parent plant doesn't want that competition. So that's next time.